In Andy Stanley's book, Fields of Gold, he tells this inspiring story in chapter 2 of a man named Milton Scott, or Mr. Milton, if you will. Milton lived a very long life. He lived to be 106 years old. Think about all the things he lived through. But think about what he lived through in his most impressionable younger years. When he was a young boy, he would have lived through the Spanish flu pandemic. That pandemic claimed 50 million lives. He also fought in and survived World War I and lived to talk about it. He lived through the Great Depression in a time when many people were experiencing great loss. Oh, how that must have impressed upon his life and caused him to live a certain way. But it may be of no surprise that Milton therefore maintained a meager lifestyle. I mean, who wouldn't after going through the Great Depression? But he raised a very large family and he lived in the same humble house for decades with his wife, the house that they built together. He owned very few clothes, even though he was a businessman and he had to go from meeting to meeting. He drove a very basic car and he replaced it every 10 years or as needed, which really would have been at least 10 years, maybe longer. What may be surprising to learn about Milton is that he owned and operated a successful textile mill. He worked at it from the age of 25, get this, until the age of 102. He secretly gave away 70 to 80% of his income. He was also one of the biggest donors of humanitarian efforts in the country of Bangladesh. He paid for the smuggling of thousands of Bibles to be brought in behind the Iron Curtain, the USSR at the time. He sponsored over 30 Wycliffe Bible translations, paid for them to go across the world, and he gave money so that he could help train South American lay pastors, many of them. But in his own backyard, he also paid the college tuition of many orphaned young adults. What an amazing man. I mean, what kind of response can you have after hearing an inspiring story as Mr. Milton? Well, Andy Stanley in his book says that your heart wants to be generous, but your emotions register fear. How many of you feel that way? You want to be generous, but you feel that fear. Stanley goes on and he says that Jesus' model for generous giving was a widow who gave her last penny. She had nothing else to rely on but the promise of God's to meet her needs. Here's a beautiful story that Jesus told, Mark chapter 12, verses 42 to 44. This poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amounts to a cent. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said to them, "Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all the contributors to the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she owned, all that she had to live on." How about you? How's your giving going? Andy Stanley says that maybe God hasn't called you to give at the level of a Milton Scott, but has he ever prompted you to give a level of generosity that felt a little uncomfortable? I believe he does. I believe he has in our lives. Stanley continues and says, has fear ever kept you from following him and doing something financially for his kingdom? He also asks, is it possible that you could get to the end of your life and never know for sure? Stanley suggests, and I encourage you, spend some time praying over where that line is for you. I love the story of Milton. The thing I love about Milton was that he was a secret giver. He gave without anyone knowing. Only God knew. How about you? This week, would you give to somebody without anyone knowing except God? I believe Jesus will do the same thing he did with this widow. He'll applaud you.